Our next presenter is Mr. Dana Nuccitelli. Dana is an environmental scientist and climate journalist with a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from UC Berkeley and a master's degree in physics from UC Davis. Dana has written for skepticalscience.com since 2010 and for The Guardian since 2013. For Yale Climate Connections since 2018. He also published the book Climatology versus Pseudoscience in 2015. So Dana, take it away.
All right, thanks, David. So this is our coronavirus curve, and we've all heard that we need to flatten the curve, which basically means we need to implement measures and policies to reduce the spread of the outbreak so that it doesn't overwhelm our healthcare system. So with climate change, we have a very similar curve. This is our carbon emissions from fossil fuels, basically since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see it's got that same exponential growth going up and up and up. We have made some progress in recent years to slow that down, but it's still going in the wrong direction at the moment. So we had the Paris Climate Agreement that virtually every country agreed to, with the goal of keeping global temperatures less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels in the future. And so if we're going to meet that curve, meet that goal, then the curve has to look something like this. Basically needs to peak very fast and then bend and go in the other direction very fast. So that's sort of our equivalent. We need to implement policies to make the curve not just flatten, but bend very dramatically in the opposite direction. So how do we do that? We need to implement policies because individual action is good, but it can only do so much. So for example, if we have individual shelter in place, but most people don't shelter in place, then that's not going to stop the spread of coronavirus. Likewise, if we have some individuals reducing their carbon emissions, but lots of other people don't, that's not going to be enough to bend this curve either. So we need to have basically government policies that create the incentive for people to change their behavior, as with shelter in place with coronavirus or with carbon emissions of climate change. So there are various categories of policy approaches to do that. One, it's called command and control, but it's basically government regulation, which that was our equivalent with coronavirus of sheltering in place, telling people that they have to stay at home as much as possible. So there are a lot of different categories of this with climate change. There are the vehicle fuel efficiency standards, the CAFE standards, which are currently a fight between the Trump administration, which wants to freeze them in place, and California and some other states, which want to keep making vehicles more fuel efficient. So this is basically the government telling car companies that they have to keep making their average fleet fuel efficiency increase over time. With the Obama administration, their EPA put forth the Clean Power Plan, which was basically a way to regulate power plants, telling them they can only emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases. That likewise has been undone by the Trump administration. Another good example is the Green New Deal, which I'm going to talk about more in a bit, which is basically a bunch of different, mostly regulation-based ways to reduce emissions. Then we have market-based approaches. And so the idea there is that you use the markets to change behaviors, because since we're in a capitalism, if something is free, people are going to take advantage of it. And so currently carbon pollution is free. And so there's a lot of carbon pollution going on. So you have to put a fee on that carbon pollution to change that behavior. So a couple ways to do that. One is with a cap and trade system. So this was originally championed by the George H.W. Bush administration when they had a problem of acid rain that they were trying to solve. They didn't want to just do it with regulations, because conservatives tend to not like regulations. So they created this concept of a cap and trade system to solve that, and it worked really well. I'll talk about that more in a bit. In California, we have a carbon cap and trade system. It was passed through Assembly Bill 32, AB 32, and that's been working pretty well too. And then the other approach you can do is just put a fee or a tax on the pollution. So Tom showed a lot of examples of carbon taxes around the world. One really good one is that Canada passed a nationwide carbon tax about 1.5 years ago. Okay, so I want to talk about the Green New Deal, because that's kind of been the big thing that's gotten a lot of attention recently, and there's not a lot of good understanding of what it is. So right now, it's basically there was a resolution passed in the House that kind of outlines, it gives the framework of what a Green New Deal would entail. The goal is to get the American economy to carbon neutrality, zero emissions as soon as possible. And it proposes to do that with this 10-year mobilization to tackle all these different aspects of our infrastructure and our economy. So for example, trying to transition all electricity to zero carbon sources, make buildings more energy efficient, tackle greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, get more electric cars, better public transportation, pull carbon out of the atmosphere with trees and technologies like Tom talked about, and invest in some green technology research and development. So there's a lot of different things they're trying to tackle within the Green New Deal. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of misinformation about the Green New Deal. So I'm going to play a little clip here with a member of Congress giving an example of such misinformation.
Since they still, in this Green New Deal, want to control my life, let me go to President Obama's favorite place and realize that if this goes through, this will be outlawed. I can no longer eat this type of thing. So before they take it away from me,
it around. I don't think it's progressive to tell me I can't have cars and airplanes. It sounds like medieval.
I don't think that's not what's being said here, Tucker.
Okay.
That you can't have cars and airplanes.
So yeah, there are a lot of these myths associated with the Green New Deal. So I'm going to really quickly go through a few of them. We just heard the one from Tucker Carlson that's going to ban airplanes and cars and stuff, and that's just not the case. We heard from the member of Congress they're going to ban hamburgers, or we hear they're going to ban farting cows. Just also not the case. And just to set the record straight, the methane emissions we worry about from cows are from their burps and their poops, not from their farts. So it'd be nice to get that correct. It doesn't say anything about nuclear energy. And there was a conservative think tank that made a bunch of silly assumptions and came up with an estimate that it will cost $93 trillion, which is just not accurate. So the strength arguments in favor of the Green New Deal is the main one is that it grasps the scale of the climate crisis we're facing. So if we're going to bend that curve, we saw how dramatically our carbon emissions have to reduce, how fast and how much they have to reduce to kind of bend the curve in the opposite direction. And to do that, we have to address all these different sectors that have significant carbon emissions: electricity, transportation, buildings, industry. And so the Green New Deal does that with this 10-year mobilization, targeting all of these different sectors. So it kind of grasps the problem that we're looking at. The main argument against it, people will say it's unrealistic. Senator Dianne Feinstein, a Democrat from California, was asked if she would support the Green New Deal, and she said no, because it's not paid for and it won't pass Congress. So I don't find those arguments compelling personally. So saying that it won't pass Congress, I mean, let's be honest, right now there's virtually nothing that will pass Congress, and certainly no significant climate policy that will pass Congress. So if you don't support anything that won't pass, then you won't support any significant climate policy at all. And saying it's not paid for, so for one thing, we do a lot of things in Congress that aren't paid for. We just passed this $2.2 trillion coronavirus stimulus that wasn't paid for. A year or two ago, we did a $1 trillion tax break that wasn't paid for. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars have cost $5 trillion that aren't paid for. So we decide if there's something that we think is important enough to do, we don't have to figure out how to pay for it immediately. And then another important point is that climate change solutions often do pay for themselves because, for one thing, they're more efficient and more cost effective over the long term, over their lifetimes, than fossil fuel technologies. And they also tend to create cleaner air and cleaner water, which creates better public health, which has economic benefits, and they slow climate change. Tom talked about all these billion-dollar climate disasters that we've been seeing, from hurricanes, fires, droughts. These things cost a lot of money. So if you're slowing climate change, then you're reducing these future climate costs from these large disasters. So you have to take that into account, that it's an upfront investment that's going to have these long-term returns. Okay, so let's talk about those market-based solutions that I mentioned. So first one, cap and trade. That's been popular for a long time. So The idea is that the government will set a cap on the total number of pollution that is allowed, and they will sell those in an auction in terms of permits. And then industry will go into the auction and they will buy as many permits as they think they need to cover their pollution. So the strength of cap and trade is that that cap gives the government control over exactly how much pollution is allowed. So if the industry goes above that level of pollution, then they have to pay a fine. And so it's better for them just to buy the permits. So the government can then set that level. They can reduce the cap over time. So you make sure you're reducing the pollution over time. And then there's also the flexibility for the companies participating in the cap and trade system to trade the permits back and forth. So if one company didn't buy enough permits, they can buy or trade permits with another company that bought too many. And so it gets more flexibility. So it's economically beneficial because of that flexibility. The downside of cap and trade is that it can be very complicated, especially, for example, if they allow offsets. Which is when a company can go outside of the cap and trade system and buy an offset somewhere else. So for example, let's say PG&E is participating in the California cap and trade system and they didn't have enough permits. So they buy some trees in the Brazilian rainforest and say, we're going to protect these trees in the Brazilian rainforest. So that's great. The trees sequester carbon. So that represents a reduction in carbon emissions. That makes sense. The problem is, it's really hard to monitor these things over time. So if like a year later, somebody cuts down those trees that PG&E had paid to protect and nobody's monitoring it, nobody realizes that the carbon emission savings are gone, but PG&E is taking credit for it. And so that's a real problem with these offsets. Like worldwide, a lot of them are kind of vaporware. They don't represent actual emissions reductions. Another one is carryover permits, which is basically when a company, when the carbon price at auction is low, they buy a whole bunch of them and bank them and kind of set them aside. And then as in future years, as the auction price for pollution permits goes up, they then say, we're going to use, instead of buying these expensive permits and reducing our emissions, we're going to use these cheaper permits that we bought in the past. And so since they're using these cheaper permits, they're not actually reducing their emissions in the future. And so basically these are ways for companies to kind of game the system with cap and trade. So that's the downside, is they can be gamed because it's such a complicated system. So then there's the carbon tax, which, as the name suggests, you put a fee or tax on the carbon pollution. So the benefit there is that it's really simple. There's no trading, there's no offsets. It's just, there's no way to game the system. The amount of carbon in the fossil fuel gets taxed, and that's it. It's very straightforward. The downside is that it doesn't have that cap that a cap and trade system has, and so the government doesn't have as much control over the total level of pollution. So it becomes tricky. You have to set the carbon fee at the right level so that it's high enough to kind of change people's behavior, to dissuade them from creating the pollution, from buying the fossil fuels, but not too high that they can't afford it and it creates economic problems. So that's the challenge with a carbon tax. And then with either of these market-based systems, they're going to generate revenue either by selling the carbon pollution permits in the cap and trade system or with the carbon tax. And so the government collects that revenue. Then there's always a debate, what do you do with that revenue? There's always fights in government. There's some revenue that can be spent. So one way to address that, it's called revenue neutrality, which is when you take all that revenue and you just send it back to taxpayers. And I'm going to talk about that some more as well. So that's what our bill does. This is the Citizens Climate Lobby bill that Tom mentioned. It's called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, House Resolution HR 763. So as Tom mentioned, it's got 81 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. It puts a fee on fossil fuels based on the amount of carbon in that fossil fuel. So we know, for example, how much carbon is in a barrel of oil or a ton of coal or a quantity of natural gas. So you just put the fee on the fossil fuel based on that carbon content. With this legislation, the carbon pollution price starts low. So it starts at $15 per ton of carbon dioxide, which if you want to put it in terms of, like, for example, a gallon of gas, it will raise the price of a gallon of gas by about 14 cents, 13 to 14 cents. So that's a relatively small increase. Gasoline prices already fluctuate more than that, so you won't notice that too much. So it kind of starts gently, but then it rises, the price rises steadily over time, $10 per ton per year, which is about 9 cents per gallon of gasoline per year. So you kind of see this price of gasoline going up, and you know it's going to keep going up in the future. And so that's going to incentivize people to change their behavior accordingly, drive less, buy a more fuel efficient car, maybe buy an electric car, for example. And then in this bill, all of the tax revenue is sent back to households equally per person with a monthly check. And I'm going to talk about why we do that. But one reason is that it makes it a small government solution, which makes it appealing to conservatives because the government isn't keeping the money and spending it, it's just sending it back to people. And then it's also progressive. I'm going to explain how it's progressive in a minute. So since it's both appeals to conservatives and progressives, then it has this bipartisan appeal. So how much will it cost? This is a nice chart that kind of shows for a $75 per ton carbon tax, which is where our bill, so say this bill were implemented in 2021, we would be at $75 per ton in 2027. So this is what it would look like in costs per year, per household, broken down by income bracket. So for the poorest 20% income brackets, it would, paying for these carbon taxes would increase the average household energy bills by $865 per year. For the richest 20%, it would increase their average household bills by $1,900 per year. And so one aspect you can see this increases the wealthier the income bracket gets. The reason for that is very simple. The wealthier you are, the more stuff you buy, the more you travel, so the bigger your carbon footprint is. And so therefore, the more you're paying in terms of carbon taxes. So that makes sense, but there is a downside here. So the wealthiest 20% in America, they're making on average, a household is making $234,000 per year. So you increase their annual bill by $1,900. It's, it's something, but they can afford it. On the other hand, if you look at the poorest 20%, on average, they're making $14,000 per household per year. Suddenly you give them another $865 bill in increased energy prices. It's really hard for them to afford that because a bigger percentage of their income is going to buying energy, a bigger proportion. So we saw a real world example of this not too long ago. France, Macron passed a gas tax, which with the goal of addressing climate change. And as a result, we saw these yellow vest protests in the streets. And remember, this is in France. This is not like a bunch of climate deniers. France is generally very supportive of doing something to tackle climate change throughout the population. The problem was that these poor households, they just couldn't afford the increased tax. And so you have to do something policy-wise so that you're not addressing climate change on the backs of these poorer households. And so the way we propose to do that is by making the carbon tax revenue neutral, sending the money back to households with an equally sized check per person. And if you do that, then you get a dividend check, something like that on an annual basis. So you can see it's the red line. It will be roughly what the check will look like for each household. And the line is above the increased energy bills for the poorer households. It's below the average bill for the richest households for their costs associated with energy use. So basically what that means is that for the poorer households, since they're getting a rebate check that's larger than their increased energy bills, they're getting a net income from this policy. And that's true for the majority of Americans and all of the, on average, the lower income households. When you get to the higher income households, because they have this larger carbon footprint, they have these larger fossil fuel costs, larger carbon costs, they are still going to have a net costs where their increased carbon prices or carbon taxes and increased energy bills are going to be larger than the dividend check, but it's still going to blunt the effect for them as well. This is why it is appealing to progressives, because this is your kind of your progressive money distribution. So you can see for the poorest 20% of households, they get roughly on average a $1,400 net income from this particular bill, from this legislation, which is actually very similar to what we're going to be getting from the coronavirus stimulus bill in terms of checks in the very near future. So then we can look at what it's going to do to fossil fuel emissions, to carbon emissions. Columbia and Rhodium did an analysis of our bill, HR 763, just recently. And so I'm going to show a couple of nice charts from that report. So this first one shows how it will change US greenhouse gas emissions. So the top light blue line is under current policy, how US emissions are expected to change. You can see they go down very little, but they're pretty flat because we don't have much in the way of a national climate policy right now. Whereas under the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, that's the dark blue on the bottom, you can see a very rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 20% less than would be under the current policy. So it's very effective, this bill, at reducing emissions. So then we can look at how it relates to our commitments. So on this chart, the dark blue is our actual US greenhouse gas emissions to date. And then the light blue is our commitments under the Copenhagen International Climate Accord and the Paris International Climate Accord, which, although Tom mentioned we're in the process of pulling out of, we are still technically in the Paris Climate Agreement. So you can see we were on track with meeting our targets up until 2016, 2017. We all know what happened then. Since then, emissions have been pretty flat. We've started to kind of pull away from our commitments, going above where our commitments would have us be. And so if we put that previous chart onto this one, under current policy, we would kind of go further and further away from our commitments. Whereas if we were just to pass this Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, it would get us back on track with our Copenhagen and our Paris climate targets. So just this one carbon tax bill is enough to at least get us moving in the right direction, back consistent with our international targets. So that's all I've got. I'm going to pass it back to David, and he's going to moderate our question and answer session.
Thank you, Dana. Well, between the two presentations, I think a message might be that we face two tremendous threats to our standard of living, COVID-19 and climate change. We've tried ignoring these problems, and now we've basically turned our entire world upside down to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, and we may need to do the same to fight climate change. We have a bunch of questions here, and I think I'll start off with the first question. Doesn't the Green New Deal cost billions or even trillions of dollars? Where are we going to find the money, and won't that destroy our economy?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I've got a couple slides related to that. So there's a group called Project Drawdown. In 2017, they actually published a New York Times best-selling book called Drawdown that basically they have energy experts and climate experts that analyze the kind of the top 100 most effective individual climate solutions, things like wind turbines and solar panels and things like that, and kind of put together a plan of how we can reduce our emissions. And then just recently, they published this called the Drawdown Review of 2020, where they did an economic analysis of all these solutions. And so the bottom line here was that if we want to keep global warming to this Paris target of less than 2 degrees Celsius, there will be an additional global investment into all these different solutions and technologies of something in the ballpark of $25 trillion. So that's a lot of money. But they also found that because these technologies are more efficient, so for example, if you think of wind turbines and solar panels, they have very little operation and maintenance costs, and then their fuel cost is free. There's no cost for wind, there's no cost for the sunlight. And so over time, they actually save money as compared to fossil fuel, where you have to keep mining coal and drilling for oil and these things. And so same thing for light bulbs and all these different technologies, LED light bulbs. Over time, over their lifetime, they actually save money as compared to these kind of fossil fuel and older technologies. And so they estimated that if you make these investments, you actually end up saving a whole lot of money. So you return your investment many times over, something in the ballpark of $125 trillion if you follow their plan. And in addition to that, that's just from like the direct savings from operations and maintenance and lifetime costs. But you also phase out these fossil fuels that cause other pollutants, that cause air pollution, water pollution, have all these adverse health effects that have really serious costs, like major costs associated with people breathing in air pollution. And they slow climate change. And so they reduce the cost of these extreme hurricanes, extreme heat waves, extreme wildfires. And so that's additionally many trillions of dollars that you're saving by implementing these solutions. So the issue is that it is, we have to be honest and say it is a big upfront investment cost, and we don't like making these big upfront investments, but over the long term, the returns are much bigger than the investments. And so that's a key thing to keep in mind.
Thank you. Another question is, what other countries have a carbon tax in place? And if only a few countries have a carbon tax, how will that work? And how is that fair? How will we solve a global problem with only a US policy?
A lot of countries already have carbon taxes in place. So a lot of countries are already addressing this problem. And then another way to do this is that in our bill, I didn't mention it has a border adjustment, which basically means that when we import something from another country, if that country doesn't have a carbon tax in place, then we basically implement the carbon tax and we keep the money. And so a country that's exporting to the United States, they don't want to give up that revenue. And so it gives them the incentive to implement the tax themselves so that they get to keep the carbon tax revenue. And so, yeah, if you do it in a smart way and do these kind of border adjustments, then you create the incentive for other countries to do kind of the same kind of policies.
Thank you. The next question I have from our group is, what is the cost to the U.S. per year to achieve CO2 reduction needed versus the cost of our current trajectory? In other words, what is the cost of action versus the cost of inaction?
Yeah, so I mean, it just depends on how you do it, because it's going to depend on exactly the policies that we implement. So I put out these costs. These are the global costs if you follow the project drawdown approach. But the national costs will be different. It depends, if you do it with a carbon tax or with, regulations, or if you do a Green New Deal. So, I mean, the various presidential candidates all had climate plans that were in the trillions of dollars for the United States costs. But again, these plans all yield these significant benefits in terms of more efficient technologies, less operation maintenance costs, and then, better health from reduced pollution and from reduced climate catastrophes. So, I mean, it's hard to put numbers on it because it depends on exactly what policies we implement and what path we follow. So basically the short answer is that kind of the more aggressively you implement these cheap technologies that are cheap in the long run, then that's going to be the least overall long-term cost, or the greatest overall long-term benefits. So the more aggressive you are, as with coronavirus, the more aggressive you are upfront, the better it is in the long term.
Thank you. Are you aware of any estimates of human mortality per year from climate change impacts? And could you compare that to the mortality of COVID-19?
It's really hard to estimate climate change mortalities because there are a lot of indirect ways that climate change causes deaths. So, for example, climate change will put a lot of stress on agricultural systems by creating these droughts and heat waves and things that are bad for agriculture. And then if you're reducing agricultural output, then you're increasing food prices and increasing food scarcity. And therefore, you're increasing food insecurity. And then that leads to deaths indirectly because people then can't afford enough food. It causes starvation. It causes conflicts. So I believe I've seen an estimate from the WHO that climate change causes something like 300,000 deaths per year. I think that's in the present or possibly the near future. So that is, currently larger than coronavirus deaths. Also, coronavirus is hopefully basically one-term event, whereas climate change is a long-term thing that's going to have impacts every single year. So in the long term, climate change is certainly the bigger, it's going to have more deaths associated with it than the coronavirus, but in the near term, it's hard to say. Coronavirus in the very near term is a more urgent, abrupt threat, whereas climate change is a more long-term threat.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions about food production. What are the prospects for raising enough food in a chaotic climate? And how could food production be affected if we do nothing in the next 5 years?
So the IPCC recently did a special report on land where they looked at how food insecurity is going to become a problem, kind of the closer or the further we get beyond those Paris climate targets. So basically, as you get more warming, you also get more, like I said, you get more these worse heat waves, these worse droughts, these things that put stresses on agriculture, and that creates problems with supplying enough food to everybody around the world. So yeah, the general rule is the more climate change and the more warming you have, the more stress it puts on those systems and the more problems you have with providing enough food for everybody.
Okay. Thanks. I think the last question is kind of maybe it's about hope. Seeing the response that we are seeing right now to COVID, what gives you, both of you, hope about responding to climate change?
Tom, you're good at hope.
Well, I'm on the edge here. I have hope myself. I'm optimistic that what I'm seeing in the recent couple of years, actually, the last year or 2 years, is that more of these extreme events have been happening, and the more extreme events have been happening, and people are recognizing the impacts of climate change to their own personal lives. It's slapping them in the face. Their relatives are dying. Their homes are washing away. Their fires are burning up their forests and their homes as well. So I think as the impacts get more and more extreme, people are being more and more aware of them, and they're experiencing tragedies of their own. And it's in the news all the time. I mean, every single day you see this, one extreme event or a tragedy being blasted across the television or radio or Reddit or whatever. And I think because of that, they're taking notice more. And as they take notice more, they're appreciating how bad it's getting. And now that these climate bills are in the legislature and people are communicating with their members of Congress more, and people like, CCL, Climate Lobby, is lobbying them every single year, we are making progress to helping the Congress members understand the urgency and the severity of this. So I'm hopeful that we're going to get there. It's just a matter of when. But I think the more pressure that individual US citizens apply to the congressional process, I think that will be the issue that makes it happen. So all of you out there can do your part to making sure that those members of Congress understand this is critical, this is urgent, just like COVID is urgent, and we need to apply the same kinds of approaches, not only in terms of climate change, not only to countrywide, national-wide, but also to the entire globe. And we need a leader. We need a global leader back that is going to help us interact and communicate with the global community to really solve this global climate process.
Yeah, good answer. Totally agree with that. I would say my hope would be that we can learn from coronavirus, because Tom gave us this great summary of how coronavirus and climate change are these very, very similar threats. But coronavirus is happening on much more compressed time frames. So we're kind of seeing like what happens when we deny the problem and then we wait until it's hitting us with impacts before we take action. We saw with the United States that we got this big spread of coronavirus. And so this is kind of a lesson that we need to take as much action up front to curb the outbreaks before they happen. So exact same thing with climate change. We need to curb our carbon emissions before we see these even more and more severe climate change impacts with extreme weather events and the like. Yeah. So sometimes we're not so good at learning these kinds of lessons, but we have that opportunity with the coronavirus happening on this compressed time frame to learn this lesson and to apply it to climate change, that we need to take action aggressively and quickly as possible for the best long-term outcome.
Okay, well, we're really at the end of our time today. I want to thank you all for attending our Zoom meeting. Let's all participate in the upcoming 3-day Earth Day event, including the letter writing and the phone calling that will translate our time here into action in building political will. Everyone needs to do their parts. I've posted information on the events in the chat, and there's some links there for everyone. You can access that chat later from the recording. So I hope it was a worthwhile 2 hours of your time. And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Tom Suchanek, for talking about the parallels between COVID-19 and climate change, and for really all the time that you've put in on this presentation. And thank you, Mr. Dana Nuccitelli, for your review of market-based solutions to climate change. And thanks to the Sacramento and Nevada County chapters for co-sponsoring this event. And a big thanks goes out to our friends at Nevada County Media for today's broadcast. This presentation was filmed on April 11th, so the status of the COVID-19 virus may have changed in the interim, but the data on climate change is still ongoing as it has for the last many decades. In addition to this presentation today, it will be rebroadcast by Nevada County Media on Comcast Cable 11 and Suddenly Cable 16, as well as on the Facebook pages of the Sacramento and Nevada County chapters. So remember, it's always a good time to write or call your congress member about climate change.